I need you all in or full out. Don't leave me halfway across the world.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Garden Variety Ethics. In my last video, I outlined an ethical argument in favor of veganism and provided some objections to our typical justifications for our treatment of animals. In this video, I was planning on discussing the health reasons to adopt a vegan diet. But before I do that, I want to focus first on scientific literacy. Originally, I wanted to only briefly go into some basic concepts and then dive right into the studies, but I felt an insufficient explanation of these ideas would compromise the transmissibility of the evidence. What good are these studies to the public if we don't have the tools to properly evaluate them? Do we just take them at face value since they're coming from a source of authority or expertise? Believe only the ones that support our own set of beliefs? Or just throw our hands up in the air and ignore all of them because there's so many contradictory messages? That last tendency was one that was exploited by the tobacco industry in order to sow doubt about whether smoking cigarettes was harmful. So long as they could establish some level of doubt through false or misleading evidence, the public wouldn't know what to believe, and safety regulations would be delayed. One cigarette executive said, "Doubt is our product, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. It is also the means of establishing a controversy." You may or may not be surprised to hear the same was done with fossil fuels regarding the dangers of global warming, lead in gasoline and paint regarding neurological damage, and dairy products regarding the links between saturated fat, cholesterol, and heart disease. For more information on various industries intentionally manipulating scientific evidence to stall public health regulation and confuse the public, check out David Michael's book, Doubt is Their Product. But issues like this are part of the reason why having the tools to distinguish between genuine or suspect studies, or to be able to properly interpret them at all, is so important. In addition, access to scientific literature is limited not only by the tools required to evaluate it, but also because the literature itself usually requires subscriptions that, unless paid for, are usually only available through universities and academic institutions. So not only is the literature difficult to access and understand, oftentimes it is intentionally misleading or false to further the financial interests of industries that stand to make a dollar off of that misinformation. Furthermore, unfortunately, not everybody has the time to learn the tools and diligently comb through the literature regarding everything that could be harmful to one's health or the environment. That's why having an educated populace and reputable organizations are crucial to safeguarding the interests of the public. So, in whatever capacity I can, I'm going to give my best shot at summarizing types of studies, statistical concepts, and common things to look for that could call into question the validity or authenticity of the conclusions being drawn. One method that is used to measure scientific data are observational studies. Scientists that use observational studies, importantly, as their name implies, observe and do not manipulate or interfere with any of the variables that might affect the relationships that they are studying. For instance, a scientist who wants to study the effects of bananas on human health first might start by gathering information on people who eat bananas and measuring different metrics of their health relative to those who don't. This is called a cross-sectional study, since it takes what is ideally a representative portion of the population and measures data. Then, as is common in food and medicine, the scientist might want to examine the effects of bananas on human health over time. This is because many of the effects of foods or medicine might only be apparent after a long period of time, or because the health metrics being studied might occur later in life. One way they might do this is through a case control or retrospective study, in which they gather past data on groups with differing levels of the independent variable, levels of banana consumption, for instance, on the effect of the dependent variable, health, over time. So, how did those in groups who did eat bananas differ from those who didn't? A similar design, but prospective rather than retrospective, is seen in cohort studies. These types of observational studies are useful for a number of reasons. First is because they are observational, the number of participants can be very large. For instance, a cohort study might enroll their participants, brief them about the study, and then every 2 years for, say, 30 years, send them a food frequency questionnaire, in which the participants fill out their relevant dietary habits. This can be done entirely online, and the experimenters would never need to meet with or interact with their participants. In statistics, a large sample size is preferable because it increases the power of a study, or the likelihood that the effects discovered are not a result of chance. For this reason, a large sample size is also better able to detect small effect sizes. Another benefit is that experimenters can measure the effects of things that might be unethical to administer to participants in an intervention study. You may be able to study the progress of a disease like malaria on participants who already have it. Or you can expose prisoners to infected mosquitos and give them toxic doses of a possible cure. Either way. The main issue with cohort studies is that because experimenters cannot control for all of the possible confounding variables, it's very difficult to tell whether the changes in the dependent variable are a result of the changes in the independent variable. In other words, in our hypothetical example, is it the consumption of bananas that's leading to the health effects that might be seen in a study? Or is it simply that people who eat more bananas tend to eat more vegetables, which is really what's causing a change in health? You don't know which variable is causing which. Again, this example is all hypothetical, but it does illustrate the phrase, correlation does not imply causation, which simply gets at the fact that just because evidence that a relationship between two variables exists, does not necessarily mean that one variable causes the other. A classic example of this is the statistic that murder rates increase as a function of ice cream sales. If correlation implied causation, then the evidence we had for these statistics would allow us to infer that buying ice cream causes murder rates to increase, or vice versa. Yet the simple but not altogether obvious answer is that the rates of both things change with the seasons. In the summer, people like ice cream more. They also like killing people more. One way to improve the validity of the conclusions from observational studies is to account for the other variables that may be affecting the health of the participants, such as age, sex, BMI, smoking, alcohol, exercise, and so on. By doing so, you can isolate the effect of the independent variable and have more evidence to support a causal interpretation of the data. But you can never account for every variable, and therefore correlational studies are for the most part merely suggestive of causal relationships rather than a source of proof. Still, I like to imagine Ted Bundy standing in line, eagerly awaiting his mitten chip with the body in the trunk. Studies that are designed to parse out causal relationships are known as interventional studies, the gold standard of which are randomized, placebo-controlled double-blind trials, or RCTs for short. Now there's a lot here, so I'll break it down. As a quick side note, typically a distinction is made between studies and experiments, where a study tends to be more observational, while experiments involve controlled manipulations like RCTs. Colloquially, it's acceptable to call an experiment a study, but not as much the reverse, since an experiment entails a stricter level of control. I'll try to stick to that terminology for the rest of my videos. But back to RCTs. Generally, they look something like this. Participants are brought into a lab, usually not all at once, and randomly assigned to one of at least two groups, one control group, in which no treatment is administered, and however many treatment groups. The randomization is important because it prevents grouping participants in a way that is subject to any bias that might affect how the treatment performs. It might be no wonder, for example, that your results show coffee has no effect on wakefulness when you've distributed all your narcoleptics into the treatment group. The presence of a control group is also critical because the comparison between the groups is what allows the experimenters to determine if the treatment actually had any effect. Without a control group, you wouldn't be able to know if your participants got better, for instance, because their body fought off the infection, or the treatment actually worked. Typically, when possible, a placebo is added to the control group to account for the placebo effect, which is a bizarre and fascinating effect that occurs simply through the awareness that one is being treated. So a control group will be given, like medicine, a pill that's only sugar, despite being told that they are receiving the treatment. Even though the pill has no medicinal properties, it could literally be a Skittle, on average, a small but significant benefit is observed. So the control group needs to be given this sugar pill because it may be the case that part of the benefit that is observed by the treatment group could simply be attributable to the placebo effect. Now, in a double-blind experiment, throughout the whole process, neither the experimenters nor the participants know which group is which. This is important because, for instance, the experimenter might subtly favor the treatment group, consciously or not, because they have a vested interest in the success of the treatment. On the other hand, the participants might act in accordance with or in opposition to the goal of the treatment if they knew, which again can bias the results. With all these precautions, experimenters using RCTs attempt to account for as many confounding variables as possible, and this rigorous standard helps provide conclusive causal evidence for the item in question. So if RCTs have such advantages over observational studies, why don't we always use them? Mostly, it's because of practical reasons. First, it's expensive to run these experiments, because you have to pay each participant for their time and provide the materials for the experiment. And if the number of participants is too low, then the statistical power will not be very high, which makes it more difficult to observe results that aren't a result of chance. Second, experiments that involve food, which will be most of the studies that I address, have a lot of difficulty maintaining the double-blind standard. And that's just because it's pretty obvious if you're assigned to the group that's just supposed to be cramming acorn squash down your throat. Some experiments get around that by isolating the nutrient in question and putting it in pill form, but there are limitations to that too, because as I'll go over in future videos, whole foods come as packaged deals, and part of what's healthy about them is all those pieces acting in concert. Lastly, as I brought up earlier, it's usually unethical to administer items that are suspected of being detrimental to one's health. So conveniently, we administer them to animals who can't speak up for themselves. Perhaps in a future video, I'll go over some other warning signs to watch out for when assessing the validity of a study. But for now, I'll mention one, which is funding sources and disclosures of conflicts of interest. According to this meta-analysis, or study about studies, funding from industry increased the likelihood that pro-industry results would be drawn by 3.6 times. That's not to say that all results found by industry are going to be biased or incorrect. It's just worth considering where the support for the conclusions being drawn are coming from and what incentives and interests are at play. Anyway, this video is long enough, but I hope it helps. In next week's video, I'll go over some evidence that points towards health issues related to various animal products. See you then.